Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today, we're going to talk about a number of things, but first up on the agenda is first impressions. I'll have more in just a moment. The noted motivational speaker Zig Ziglar used to say that our brains are associating machines, that they make snap associations between things that matter. And you probably have already discovered this in some respects, in that if you smell smoke, you certainly know that something is burning. Our brains are designed that way so that we can avoid danger. And a lot of what we know, or what we think we know, are things that are buried in our subconscious mind. And as a result of that, sometimes we know things that we can't explain, and as a result of that, we make decisions based on faulty data. So let's play a little game here. I'm going to show you a photograph. Now, it is said that we form first impressions often in less than a second. So I'm going to put these photographs up for less than a second. And here's the first one. All right, now before I move on to the second one, I want you to think a little bit about what you saw there and what kinds of first impressions you might get from that photo. Is this a good person, a bad person? What do you think? What do you think about this person? Now, you can't share that with me, but write it down somewhere, maybe, just to kind of keep track of this. All right, here's the next photo. What do you think? A band member certainly has long hair and a beard. Maybe somebody who plays guitar or bass for a rock band. Maybe. Let's look at this next one. What do you see there? A rather attractive, dark-haired young lady. And then in this one, another rather attractive, dark-haired young lady. Now, let's explore our first impressions, particularly with this one. If I told you that this person was arrested for rape, would that change your impression of him? Probably so. If I went on to tell you that he later confessed to that rape, would you believe that he had confessed to that rape? If I tell you he was later convicted of that rape and sent to prison, how would that impact your view of him? Now, let's look at this next photograph. And we looked at this earlier. Maybe he's a rock star, but he isn't. Here's his other photograph. And this is the photograph from when he was booked for the kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart. Do you notice how your view changed of him the minute you saw that he was in an orange jumpsuit? You immediately knew that something was wrong here. Again, that is your mind playing the association game. People who appear in photographs in orange jumpsuits are criminals. It doesn't matter whether they've been convicted or not. In this case, he has, but it doesn't matter. Now, what about this photograph? You probably recognize the young lady now. She indeed was tried and acquitted of murder. But when you see this mugshot, you immediately recall all of the things that you thought during that trial. And finally, this one you may not recognize, but this is Carla Faye Tucker. Or I should say was Carla Faye Tucker. She's no longer with us because the state of Texas executed her for a murder where this demure-looking young lady killed people with a pickaxe and said she enjoyed it. Now, if our first impressions are wrong, they are often wrong because we have been conditioned to reach certain first impressions and make certain first judgments by our conditioning over the last however many years you've been around. For me, it's 67. I have a lot of history in my head, and as a result of that, I tend to make snap judgments about people based on all of that history. Even though I try not to, I still do that. Now, you're probably thinking, well, I can't be conditioned, but I believe that you probably can. So let's play a game here. If I were to tell you that I was out of money, you would say that I was broke. And if I told you that I told you a funny story, you would probably say I told you a joke, right? If we say that someone was awakened, we usually say they are woke. We wouldn't say that we pushed somebody with our finger. We would say we gave them a poke. When someone lights up a cigarette, we say that they had a smoke. And when you see this bottle, you know that this bottle is a Coke. And when you see this, you know that the white of the egg is called the... you see what you did there? Most of you who haven't seen this little test before answered yolk. But the white of the egg is not the yolk. The white of the egg is called the albumin. The yellow of the egg is called the yolk. But since all of these things fit a pattern and they all ended with oak, you immediately jumped to yolk. And that is how our minds work. The first time I took this, I was absolutely paying attention, and I still said yolk. And that's because, again, our minds are associational machines. So that first image that I showed you of the young African-American man who was arrested for rape, confessed to rape, was tried and convicted for rape, was ultimately exonerated because his DNA was nowhere on the victim, and the real perpetrator finally came forward and confessed that he was the perpetrator. But here is the interesting thing about that. The Manhattan DA's office that prosecuted that case, they had the DNA run from the victim, and it didn't match this young man. But they still prosecuted it as a rape, even though they had conflicting evidence, and even though they didn't turn that evidence over for testing to the defense. Now, I want you to think back about what you thought about this young person before I said anything about his supposed crimes. In most cases, people tend to view this person negatively for two reasons. One, because he's African American, and two, because he's appearing in a mugshot. And that is due in large part to depictions of criminals in the media. If you were to go back and look at the Dirty Harry movies or the crime shows from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and since the millennia, you would find that even though African Americans only make up 35% of the population, they make up somewhere between 60 and 75%, depending on how you do the analysis, of criminals portrayed in the media, in movies, in TV. And we often see mugshots of these people well before they go to trial. And again, our minds make immediate associations that if you're wearing an orange jumpsuit, you're guilty. Now, if you form that view in your mind, even though you may not consciously think about it, when you're called for jury duty and you see the person and they're in an orange jumpsuit, you're likely going to start with the presumption of guilt as opposed to the presumption of innocence. And even though you swear on a stack of Bibles that you can be fair, that implicit bias that you have, that implicit learning that has taken place over the course of your life, may negate all of your efforts to try to be fair. Because, I mean, after all, the police arrested you, you must be guilty, right? And in that particular case, he confessed. But when you know that the confession occurred after about 20 hours of constant interrogation in a small windowless room, with persons badgering this young man back and forth for hours at a time, convincing him with leading questions that he did this crime, even though he knew he didn't, even though he started off saying, "No, I didn't." Again, your presumption is this guy is a bad actor, when in fact he was not. He was just a kid running through the park at night. But the bottom line is, we jump to conclusions based on how somebody looks. I am as guilty of it as anyone else. And I try very hard not to do that particular thing. But because of all of the media messages and the images that are shown every day, day in and day out, we tend to make snap judgments. Now, look at this photo. It's a happy family, right? But if I told you that the father pictured here took his 2 children to Mexico and shot them with a spearfishing gun and killed them, the image that you formed when you first saw him of a happy family man is destroyed. So I think it's very important for us to realize, and particularly when we are called for jury duty, that everything we see needs to be tested against what the evidence is and also how probable and believable the testimony is. I'm going to show you an image here from Amazon about a book written by a gentleman by the name of Saul Kasem. Now, Saul is a professor, and he is a psychologist, and he has done a lot of work on false confessions. And indeed, that's what this book is all about. And the story that I just talked to you about comes directly from that book. I have blinded a lot of the other details, but the bottom line is Dr. Kasem talks about this person in his book, and he lets us see, he lifts the veil on police interrogation tactics and on how false confessions come about, and how sometimes people who know they are innocent can be made to believe that they are guilty. Now that flies in the face of everything we know. I wouldn't confess to something I didn't do, but people do it all the time. So the purpose of this video is to let you understand that sometimes it really is the guy behind the curtain and not the person on the screen that you see. Sometimes things are orchestrated in a dark, windowless room with detectives, overbearing detectives, essentially forcing a confession out of someone, and gross miscarriages of justice happen as a result. That's not to suggest that everybody who confesses inappropriately. But anytime you see a confession that occurred after more than about 6 hours, there is at least there should be some skepticism about how you judge that confession. So hopefully I have lifted the veil here today a little bit on how we think and how we are sort of programmed with this implicit bias to think, and how we're conditioned by images that we see in the media. I would point out that even African Americans, when they see an African American in a jumpsuit or with a little plaque underneath their face indicating that the NYPD has arrested them, tend to believe that that person is guilty, even though they probably have had a number of experiences that most people who are white would never expect to have. And they understand sometimes that the police are not always good actors. I have not personally had an interaction with a police officer who wasn't a nice guy, but that doesn't mean that they're not out there. So give this some thought, and I would love to hear your comments down below. You know, all the things I ask you to do: like, share, subscribe. Think about this and let me know. Appreciate everything you guys do on the channel, especially your comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a terrific day. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.